President Trump today called the suspected chemical attack in Syria atrocious and a barbaric act. He says he's very concerned, and scenes like what played out there cannot be allowed to happen. He will be meeting with senior military leadership tonight. On Sunday, the president tweeted, quote, "President Putin, Russia, and Iran are responsible for backing al-Assad," and claimed there would be a, quote, "big price to pay." The president also slammed his predecessor, President Obama. He says he will make a decision on how to respond within 48 hours. Defense Secretary James Mattis was asked about potential action this morning.
Can you rule out taking actions, launching airstrikes against Assad, Mr. Secretary?
I don't rule out anything right now. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Hunter Walker is a White House reporter for Yahoo News and joins us now. Hunter, we heard from the president, we heard from Secretary Mattis. Any indication as to what is on the table and what is the president's red line in Syria?
Well, military action is clearly on the table, as the Secretary of Defense said. And, you know, last year when we saw that large-scale sarin attack in Khan Sheikhoun, there was a large airstrike of, I believe, 59 cruise missiles that we launched against the Syrian regime. So something like that may be on the table this time, but I think the question of what is President Trump's red line is much less clear. He's criticized President Obama for, you know, allowing the Assad regime to violate the red line of not using chemical weapons. And yet between these two larger attacks, the Syrian regime's been accused of a lot of smaller scale chlorine attacks. And we saw that, you know, just prior to this, President Trump was talking about pulling out U.S. troops from Syria. So, you know, even if he does launch an airstrike in response to this attack, it doesn't seem to be part of a coherent and overarching strategy, because we have allowed the Assad regime to use chemical weapons in the past.
You know, so as you mentioned, he did say he wanted to pull out of Syria. Is it apparent now that this has changed all that, or is this sort of a temporary blip?
I think we'll be finding out in the coming days. You know, there really hasn't ever been a united front from the administration on this. The president implied that ISIS was defeated, you know, a couple weeks after Secretary Mattis had said something much different. And the president is reportedly at odds with much of military leadership about whether or not we should leave Syria and whether the mission against ISIS is finished there. And of course, you know, the question of the fight against ISIS is a totally separate issue from what's going on with the Assad regime and, you know, whether they should remain in power.
And of course, today is the first day on the job for National Security Advisor John Bolton. He has a lot on his plate to start. Any indication where he leans on responding to the situation in Syria?
Yeah, it's really a big day for him to be walking in. I think, you know, in general, Bolton is characterized as the most hawkish hawk there is, and particularly when it comes to Iran. So the involvement of Iran and the troops on the ground from that country is really interesting here, and he definitely wants to curb their influence and take an aggressive stance with them. He's also, earlier on in the Syrian civil war, talked about regime change in that country, which really is his favored strategy. So I think we can expect an aggressive strategy being advocated by Bolton. The question is, as it so often is in this administration, among these competing voices with Secretary of Defense Mattis as sort of a noted moderating influence, who will win out?
Well, speaking of competing voices, we all know there's been a lot of recent turnover. So is there a sense that the White House is functioning in an organized way in response to these crises? Is everyone on the same page with the president?
Well, you know, on the trade war front, which is another big issue that I think has security implications as well, the president's reportedly sort of winging it and figuring it out as he goes along. Over the weekend, we also saw another notable departure that's gotten a little less attention than some of the other exits, which was Michael Anton, one of the big spokespeople on the National Security Council. And it was quite interesting to see him leave just ahead of Bolton's arrival, as they would have been expected to work closely together. And Michael Anton is someone I profiled in the earlier days of the administration. He was seen as one of the more intellectual figures in the White House, and, you know, was a former George W. Bush official who, you know, had written for conservative journals and was more of a traditional establishment conservative voice. I think one clear trend amid all this turnover is we're seeing those more traditional figures leave as the president gets more of a cable news influenced cabinet.
Well, you brought up the trade, fracas with China. I don't want to call it a war yet, which we'll get to that in just a second. I do want to point out, though, that the president called out Vladimir Putin for backing Assad. First time we saw him do it so stridently in a tweet, which again could indicate he's listening somewhat more to his advisors who have reportedly wanted him to be a little bit harsher on Putin. But what does all of this mean for their relationship and the president's hope for an in-person meeting?
Well, I've talked to a couple foreign policy experts who definitely say there's been a hardening in President Trump's approach to Russia. We saw sort of two different sets of sanctions in recent weeks. One targeting these oligarchs that are members of Putin's inner circle and their finances, which is really one that experts say hits a lot closer to home for the Russian president. And of course, we also now see the president calling out Putin by name. So he does seem to be taking a tougher stance. But again, with all the issues that we're discussing today, I think it's not entirely clear that it's all part of a cohesive strategy. And you have these sanctions going against Russia. You have the president, blaming Putin for his role in propping up the Assad regime. But you also have him saying he wants to make a deal with Putin. In his press appearance with the Baltic leaders last week, President Trump said he believes he could have a good relationship with Russia. So it's not entirely certain what he's asking for or how he wants to go about getting it.
A little bit back and forth. All right, now, Hunter, let's switch gears to that trade war or potential trade war with China. The president said China is taking advantage. Let's play some sound from the president's chief economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, this morning.
No tariffs have been enacted, okay? And discussions are ongoing. So that's not a trade war. I don't want to speak for anybody here. Tariffs are part of the discussions, but I cannot say there will be this, there will be that. That's up to the president. Can I just make that as clear? The president will make those decisions. He has said to me, tariffs are part of the discussion, as are negotiations.
What is it? And this morning, the president called trade with China, quote, stupid. So is there any indication the U.S. or China are willing to back off of these threats?
Well, the president, as much as he's rattled the sabers here, has also said he hopes to make a deal and he's confident China will back down. It's not clear where he's getting that, but I certainly don't think he wants to have a trade war here. And I think that's part of why we've seen Kudlow and other advisors try to temper those threats. We've also seen the market react really negatively every time the threat ratchets up, and then the market seems to recover a bit every time tensions cool. So, what we've seen with tariffs from President Trump in the past is that he throws out these threats and then he hopes to negotiate.
And the president did also praise his relationship with President Xi of China today. Yesterday, he said they'll always be friends despite trade tensions. So that seems to indicate the president might still expect China's help on other issues.
Exactly. And, your viewers may remember that President Trump hosted Xi at Mar-a-Lago and the two golfed together, and then they visited again in Beijing. I think if I can try to find, and again, as we've said throughout this segment, it's kind of hard, but if I can try to find a thread going through all of this, President Trump sees himself as a uniquely qualified deal maker. As he did on the campaign trail, in these moments, he's boasting about his personal relationships with Xi, his potential for having personal relationships. In talking to some allies of the president, they've said they want Bolton and his hawkish stance to serve as sort of a bad cop. So I think what we're seeing is tensions ratcheting up as President Trump hopes to swoop in and be the deal maker and salvage everything on all these different fronts. But of course, Syria is a huge powder keg. The market would react extremely negatively to a trade war or even the threat thereof. So in all of this, he's sort of playing with fire and kind of hoping to swoop in at the last minute.
And Syria was an unexpected powder keg at that. All right, Hunter Walker, thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks for having me.